All right, we're going to take a quick walk through the whitelist contract here that we've converted from Rust to AssemblyScript. This is one of the near core contracts, and we'll look through it now. So folder structure, this just came from a create near app, and we're just concentrating on what's in the contract with the assembly directory and this top portion here. So when I create AssemblyScript contracts, I usually divide things up so that we got the data models, the types, and then the main file here. So starting with the types, just importing a U128, and then we're exporting a type called an account ID, which is basically just a string, which represents a near account, like myaccount.near. Moving on to the models. This is where everything gets stored. So we're importing a persistent set from the near SDK, AssemblyScript SDK. We're importing the type that we just defined in the type folder. And then we're establishing two persistent storage structures, two persistent sets, a whitelist and a factory whitelist. And then we're creating one class, which is a whitelist contract, which will contain the foundation account ID, which is the ID of the near foundation. They're the ones that will whitelist staking pool factories, which then can in turn whitelist staking pools that want to use them. The whitelisted account IDs of approved staking pool contracts are also put into a persistent set. These are all account IDs as well. And then we have the factory whitelist, so this is the whitelist of all the staking pool factories. It just creates a constructor so that we can call it in the main file and make a class, and that's that file. Moving on to the main file, so we import a couple things from the SDK, allowing us to access storage, the environment variables, and the context variables. We bring in the models that we created in the model file. We bring in the types, and then we set a global variable for a contract, which is a type whitelist contract, which is the model that we define in the model file. Moving down to the main, first thing we do is initiate the contract. So when we deploy this contract, we'll call the init function at the same time, passing it the foundation account ID and setting that right away. It'll check to see that the contract has not already been initialized by checking to see if this key has been set in storage. If it has, then it'll panic and it'll quit right there. Second check we do is to make sure that the foundation account ID that was passed in is a valid account ID. Otherwise, it again will panic and quit. And third, then we create the new whitelist contract class, passing in the foundation account ID and the two storage structures that we're going to use to store the whitelist and the factory whitelist. And finally, before we leave that, we create that storage variable called init, set it to true to show that the contract's now been initialized. And that's basically the main contract sets things up. Move on to the getters that we have. So we have two. First, to determine if a staking pool account ID has been whitelisted or not. So it'll take that in, checks to make sure it's a valid account. Well, first we make sure that the contract's initialized. Then we check to see that it's a valid account. And if it is, then we check to see if the whitelist persistent set structure has that staking pool account ID, and if it does, it'll return true. Otherwise, it'll return false. And then pretty much the same thing, but at the factory, for the factory whitelist, takes in the factory account ID, checks to make sure that's a valid account, and then returns whether it's in there or not, true or false. Moving down to the factory and foundation. So add the given staking pool account ID to the whitelist. So this is basically adding something that adds the staking pool account ID to the whitelist. So first, again, just doing the check to make sure that's a valid account ID. And then we either make sure that this is only being called by a whitelisted factory or by the foundation. So if we check to see if the factory whitelist structure has whoever is sending this request in. If they're not in that, then we check to see if they're the foundation, and assuming they're one of those two, then it'll add that staking pool account ID to that whitelist. This assert called by foundation is just that's a private internal function on this contract, and it's down here at the bottom. And this little underscore denotes that it's a private function. Doesn't return anything, but basically it just does an assertion to check that whoever is sending it is equal to the foundation account ID on the contract, and if not, it's going to panic and quit, and that's that check. While we're here, we can take a look at the is-init check as well. So we put these in each of the functions just to make sure that nothing's being called before the contract is initialized. But it'll looks for the init storage key and make sure that it's true. Otherwise, we send the message back that it'll panic and send the message saying the contract should be initialized before usage. All right, so moving back up, we left off here. So at the foundation piece here. So the foundation retains the ability to remove and add things in this contract. First off, it's able to remove a staking pool account ID, so account ID from the staking pool. First off, we check that contract's good to go, make sure that it's the foundation account calling this, making sure that the account ID of the staking pool is valid, and then if all three of those conditions are met, it'll delete that account ID from the whitelist, the staking pool whitelist. Second, the ability to add a factory, so the factory account ID. So the Near Foundation adds all the factories, and then the factories themselves can whitelist staking pools. So this is just adding the factory. Again, we do the same three checks, making sure it's the right account ID, it's the foundation, and then assuming it is, we add it to the factory whitelist persistence set here and return true. And finally, we're able to, or the Near Foundation is able to remove a factory from the whitelist. Same three checks again, checks the account ID is valid, that it's being called by the foundation, and the contract's good to go, and then it'll delete it from the factory whitelist, returning true. And that is the entirety of the whitelist contract of the Near Core contracts.